Somewhere in the volcanic highlands of the Canary Islands, tucked into the dry dark of a lava tube or a natural cave carved by wind and time, a body has been resting for somewhere between 500 and 1,000 years. The air in these chambers holds almost no moisture, the temperature barely shifts, and so, rather than returning to dust the way most human remains do, the body simply stays, dries, preserves, waits. Nobody buried it there intending for us to find it centuries later. Nobody left a note. Nobody anticipated that one day, researchers with sequencing equipment and careful hands would extract fragments of genetic material from that preserved tissue and come away genuinely surprised by what they found. That's the quiet mystery at the centre of this story. Not a dramatic one, not the kind with hidden tombs or golden masks, but the slower, stranger kind. The kind where the evidence has been sitting in the dark for a very long time, and even after we found it, even after we analysed it with every tool modern science could offer, the picture that emerged didn't match what many people had assumed. The Canary Islands sit in the Atlantic Ocean off the northwestern coast of Africa, roughly 100 kilometres from the Moroccan and Western Saharan shoreline at the closest point. 7 main islands, all of volcanic origin, rising sharply from deep ocean floor. In terms of geography, they're African adjacent. In terms of isolation, they might as well have been their own world for long stretches of their history. There are no land bridges. There's no easy way to drift there by accident. Getting to the Canaries required intentional navigation, which means whoever first settled them arrived by choice, not chance. That's where things start to get interesting. Because the Atlantic, especially in the centuries surrounding European expansion, was a crossing point, a place where trade winds and ocean currents created routes that connected continents. The Canaries would eventually become a critical stopover for ships heading toward the Americas. They sat at an intersection, and yet for much of their prehistoric period, the people living on those islands appear to have been remarkably cut off, an isolation chamber as much as a crossroads, both things at once depending on the era. The people who lived there before European contact in the 14th and 15th centuries are known today as the Guanches, though that name originally referred specifically to the people of Tenerife and was applied more broadly later. They left behind stone tools, preserved foods, rock art, and those extraordinary mummified bodies. What they didn't leave behind was a written record in any form we've yet decoded, so archaeologists have had to read their lives from what the physical evidence allows, and geneticists have had to do the same from what survived inside ancient tissue and bone. What those two disciplines found, when brought together carefully and honestly, raises questions that still don't have clean answers, and we'll get into all of it. The mummies themselves, how they were made, when they were made, who made them, and what the DNA results actually said versus what headlines claimed they said. There's a difference between those last two things, and that difference matters. But first, if you're settling in for this one, I'd love to know where you are right now, and what time it is wherever you're listening. Drop it in the comments. It's genuinely one of my favourite things to read. Someone always turns up unexpectedly, and it never gets old. The Canary Islands are not all the same place. That sounds obvious, but it matters more than you might expect when you're trying to understand what survived there and why. The archipelago stretches across several hundred kilometres of Atlantic Ocean, and the 7 main islands vary dramatically in elevation, humidity, vegetation and volcanic geology. Tenerife has a peak that rises above 3,700 metres, high enough to have snow, high enough that the climate bands shift completely as you move up the slope. Lanzarote further east is lower and drier, almost desert-like in places, heavily shaped by relatively recent eruptions that left black lava fields across much of its surface. Gran Canaria sits between those extremes. La Palma is steep and forested. The differences aren't minor. They're the kind of differences that shape what people eat, how they build shelters, how they bury their dead, and ultimately what traces of those lives survive long enough for anyone to study. What preserves a body is, at its simplest, the absence of the things that destroy it. Moisture invites microbial activity, and microbial activity is the primary engine of decomposition. Remove the moisture, lower the temperature, add good airflow, and organic material can persist for a very long time. The Canaries, particularly in their higher and more arid zones, have natural environments that can do exactly this without any human intervention at all. Lava tubes and natural caves carved into volcanic rock maintain stable temperatures year-round, buffered from the outside swings of heat and cold. In the dry eastern islands especially, humidity inside those chambers can drop low enough that tissue desiccates faster than bacteria can break it down. This is important because it means you don't need an embalming tradition to end up with a mummy. You need the right cave at the right elevation, in the right geological environment, and the body will do some of the work on its own. Preservation here exists on a spectrum. At one end, you have completely desiccated remains, skin intact, sometimes with hair, sometimes with fragments of the plant fiber bindings or textiles used to wrap the body. At the other end, you have bones, some well preserved and some fragmented, sometimes stained by the minerals of the cave floor, sometimes warped by moisture that found its way in over centuries. In between, you have everything from partial mummification to bodies where only certain conditions preserved certain parts. This matters for how we use the word mummy in this context. It doesn't always mean an intentionally embalmed individual in the Egyptian tradition, with organs removed and resins applied and rituals performed over weeks. Some of the Canarian mummies were deliberately prepared, and we'll look at that closely later. But others may have mummified primarily because of where they ended up. The two pathways can be hard to separate at a distance of several centuries, and researchers have had to be careful about assuming one when the evidence might equally support the other. The geography of the islands also shapes something else, which is the cultural and genetic landscape of the people who lived there. Because the distances between islands, while not enormous, were enough that inter-island contact wasn't constant or guaranteed. Archaeological evidence suggests that different islands developed recognizably distinct material cultures over time, variations in tool types, pottery, burial practices, and the way bodies were prepared and placed. Whether those differences reflect true isolation, periodic contact and divergence, or populations that arrived from different places at different times is one of the questions ancient DNA has been trying to answer. Which brings us to the DNA itself, and why the islands create such specific challenges for recovering it. Ancient genetic material degrades over time in ways that depend heavily on the same environmental conditions that affect physical preservation. Low humidity and stable temperatures help. High humidity, freeze-thaw cycles, and acidic soils all accelerate the breakdown of DNA into fragments too small or too damaged to read reliably. In the well-preserved Canarian mummies, there is sometimes enough intact genetic material to work with. But there's another problem that the very same conditions create. The dry enclosed environment of a cave that preserved one ancient body perfectly has also preserved everything else that came into contact with it. Researchers who handled these remains over centuries, museum workers, earlier scientists, curious visitors, all of them left traces. Contamination is one of the central technical challenges of ancient DNA research, and in a context where the remains have been moved, studied and stored under varying conditions since the 1400s, it becomes a particularly serious one. The environment that made the mummies possible is the same environment that makes understanding them difficult. When Europeans arrived in the Canary Islands in force during the 14th and 15th centuries, they found people already there. That fact alone deserved careful attention. Instead, what followed was a process of observation tangled so thoroughly with assumption, political interest, and outright invention that separating the reliable from the distorted has kept historians busy for the better part of 500 years. The Spanish conquest of the islands was completed in stages, with the final major island subdued in 1496. The chronicles that emerged from this period were written by conquerors, missionaries, and administrators, people with agendas that shaped what they noticed, what they recorded, and what they chose to emphasize. Some of the accounts contain genuinely useful detail, others read more as justifications for conquest dressed up as description. The challenge is that they're often the same texts. Several early writers remarked on the islanders' physical appearance with the kind of specificity that suggests genuine observation. They noted height, hair color, skin tone. Some accounts described the islanders as fair or light-skinned, and this detail would carry enormous weight in later centuries as scholars tried to construct theories about where these people came from. Others described them as darker. The contradictions were never really resolved, partly because the writers weren't all describing the same island, and partly because their perceptions were filtered through their own assumptions about what different kinds of people were supposed to look like. A European chronicler in 1500 was not a neutral observer with a notebook. He was a person embedded in a particular worldview that had strong ideas about the relationship between appearance, civilization, and moral worth. The word Guanche is a good example of how language can both preserve and distort. The term came from the indigenous people of Tenerife specifically, likely from a word in their own language meaning something close to person from Tenerife, or perhaps person of the mountain. But as European use of it spread, it got applied more and more loosely until it became a catch-all label for all the indigenous inhabitants of all the islands, regardless of the fact that those populations spoke related but distinct languages, had different material cultures, and had likely developed along somewhat separate trajectories for generations. Calling all of them Guanche is a bit like calling everyone in medieval Europe by the name of whichever group you happen to encounter first. It flattens something that was genuinely varied into a single thing that's easier to talk about, but harder to understand accurately. The chroniclers also had a particular interest in fitting the islanders into existing frameworks of knowledge. The most persistent of these frameworks was the question of origin. Where did these people come from? This wasn't just academic curiosity. In the intellectual climate of late medieval and early modern Europe, the answer to that question carried moral and theological implications. If the islanders could be connected to a known ancient people, that connection shaped how they were categorized, whether they were considered fully human in the theological sense, what obligations their conquerors might or might not have toward them. So writers reached for comparisons. Some connected the islanders to ancient Berber or North African peoples. Others proposed they were remnants of lost civilizations, including, inevitably, Atlantis. That particular theory has proven remarkably durable, despite having essentially no evidentiary foundation. There were suggestions of Phoenician origin, of connections to ancient Carthage, of descent from the Romans. Each theory said something about the person proposing it, about what kind of ancestor seemed prestigious or plausible within their worldview. The islanders themselves were consulted surprisingly rarely, and their own oral traditions, which did include accounts of origins and ancient memory, were recorded only patchily, and often through intermediaries with their own interests in shaping the narrative. What the early accounts got more reliably, at least in some cases, was the basic shape of daily life. The islanders herded goats and sheep. They cultivated grain, primarily barley, which they ground and roasted into a staple food still made in the islands today. They lived in caves in some areas, and in stone structures in others. They had divisions of social rank. They practiced forms of ritual and ceremony that the Spanish observers found alternately impressive and threatening. They had leaders. They had laws. They had methods of mummifying the dead that struck European observers as both sophisticated and strange. It's worth pausing on that last point, because the mummification practices became one of the most discussed and most mythologized aspects of early accounts. Several chroniclers described the process in some detail, mentioning the removal of organs, the use of various substances to preserve the body, the wrapping in animal skins. These descriptions vary enough between accounts that scholars today disagree about which elements were accurate observations and which were elaborations based on what the writers thought such a process should involve, perhaps coloured by knowledge of Egyptian practices that had been circulating in European scholarly literature since antiquity. The comparison to Egyptian mummification was made early and repeated often, and it did real damage to clear thinking about the Canarian practices, because it encouraged the assumption that the two traditions must be connected rather than independent developments, when the actual evidence for any such connection remains quite thin. Some of the physical observations embedded in the chronicles have held up better. The descriptions of the islanders as pastoralists with a Gofio-based diet align with what archaeology has confirmed. The accounts of multi-island political complexity, with different leaders controlling different territories and different islands having distinct customs, match the archaeological record better than the flattening tendency of the Guanche label would suggest. The descriptions of certain burial practices in caves have also proved partially accurate, in the sense that the caves were real and the bodies were there, even if the exact methods of preparation remain debated. But the interpretive weight that got piled onto those observations has been the lasting problem. The chronicles described the islanders in ways that served conquest narratives, either as noble primitives untouched by civilization and therefore in need of guidance, or as savages whose subjugation was justified by their supposed backwardness. Neither framing was designed to produce accurate understanding. Both shaped European assumptions about Canarian identity for centuries, and both influenced the questions that later scholars thought to ask, including the question of where these people came from, and whether their origins were something to be proud of or ashamed of or fascinated by. All of that textual baggage was still sitting in the background when researchers started collecting bone and tissue samples for genetic analysis. The DNA doesn't read the chronicles. It doesn't know what Guanche was supposed to mean, or what theories about Atlantis or Berber ancestry or ancient Egyptians were riding on the answer. But the people asking questions of the DNA absolutely did. That tension between what the texts claimed and what the biology might reveal is one of the things that made the results, when they finally came, genuinely surprising. So who were these people, really, beneath all the names that outsiders gave them? If you strip away the more imaginative theories, a quieter, more grounded picture emerges, and most archaeologists working in the islands today would agree on its outlines. Before the Spanish conquest, the Canaries were home to multiple indigenous communities, who had been there for many centuries, perhaps more than a millennium. They were not a single uniform culture stamped copy-paste across the archipelago. Each island, and often different regions within an island, developed its own way of doing things, shaped by its particular terrain, climate, and history of contact with neighbours. Tenerife, with its towering volcano and steep ravines, is not the same world as the low, dry plains of Fuerteventura, or the wet, forested slopes of La Palma. Those differences matter. They show up in how people built their homes, what they ate, what they made with their hands, even how they buried their dead. Across the islands, pastoralism seems to have been the thread that ran through almost everything. Goats and sheep were central. Their milk, meat, hides, and bones underpinned daily life. Their movements shaped seasonal rhythms. Many cave sites are layered with dung, ash, and animal bone, the sediments of centuries of herding. Farming was present, but not everywhere to the same degree. On some islands, especially those with more reliable water and better soils, there is clear evidence of agriculture. Terraces, storage silos, carbonized grains. Barley dominates, along with some wheat and pulses. The roasted ground flour that the chroniclers described has left its fingerprints in charred residues on pottery, and in worn grinding stones that still bear the polish of thousands of circular motions. On the drier, wind-scraped islands, cultivation seems to have been more limited or more precarious. There, herding combined with gathering wild resources and in some places modest fishing. The sea was always present, but the archaeological record suggests that not every island community exploited it equally. Fish bones, shells, and fishing tools are abundant in some coastal sites, and surprisingly scarce in others, hinting again at cultural choice layered over environmental opportunity. Gathering never really disappeared either. Pollen, seeds, and charred plant remains point to wild fruits, nuts, and other plants being part of the diet. It was not a simple story of hunter-gatherers turning into farmers in a straight line, but a flexible mosaic. Herders who also planted crops where they could, who fished when it made sense, who knew the wild plants of their landscapes as well as any forager. Their settlements were just as varied. In many places, caves were not just burial sites, but living spaces. Natural rock shelters, enlarged with simple modifications, offered stable temperatures and protection from wind. On some islands, entire communities seem to have lived in such cave clusters, moving between them with the seasons. Elsewhere, people built. Dry stone structures, sometimes with multiple rooms, appear on exposed ridges and near cultivated zones. Some look like farmsteads, others like more substantial villages. A few sites include what appear to be communal or ceremonial spaces, larger enclosures, carefully arranged stones, features that do not fit neatly into the category of house or barn. The tools they used were largely of stone, bone, and wood, but that doesn't mean crude. Stone toolkits show a consistent practiced tradition. Scrapers, knives, points, grinding stones, all adapted to working hides, cutting meat, processing plants, and shaping other materials. On some islands, volcanic glass was plentiful and used to make razor-sharp edges. On others, people relied on different local rocks but produced similar forms, suggesting shared ideas travelling even where raw materials did not. Pottery gives perhaps the clearest sense of both connection and difference. There is no wheel-thrown fine ware here. The vessels were hand-built, often by coiling and smoothing, then fired in open hearths. Yet within that shared technology, island-specific styles emerged. Decorative motifs, rim shapes, and surface treatments differ enough that archaeologists can usually tell at a glance where a pot was made. Certain forms cluster on certain islands, hinting at local traditions and identities. Evidence for trade or contact between islands is there, but it is more limited and structured than some earlier writers imagined. Particular kinds of stone that only occur on one island turn up, worked into tools on another. Shells from specific coastal zones appear inland. There are enough such finds to show that crossing between islands did happen, that ideas and materials moved. But the pattern doesn't look like a fully integrated maritime network with constant back and forth traffic. Instead, it suggests periodic, perhaps risky journeys, contacts that could be important, but not necessarily routine for everyone. When we turn to language, we are listening to echoes rather than full voices. The indigenous languages of the islands were largely supplanted within a few generations of conquest. What remains are fragments, place names, words recorded by early chroniclers, bits of vocabulary preserved in later folk usage. Linguists have spent decades comparing these scraps to modern and ancient languages, especially in North Africa. Those comparisons keep pointing in a similar direction. Many of the survivals line up with Berber or Amazigh, languages of the Maghreb and the Sahara. Not one-to-one, like a dialect someone could speak fluently today, but close enough in sounds and roots that most specialists accept some form of North African link. That doesn't mean a single migration event or a simple map line drawn from one specific tribe to one specific island. Languages shift over time, people mix, identities blur. But the general picture of ancestral ties to populations in North Africa is one of the stronger threads that runs through both linguistic and later genetic work. This is where the myths tend to gather. Once you have mummies, stone structures, and a whiff of ancient connection, more extravagant stories rush in to fill the gaps. Atlantean survivors, lost Romans blown off course, secret colonies of Egyptians preserving exotic rites on remote shores. These tales have proven resilient, in part because they are dramatic and flattering. They make the islands into a hidden chapter of some grander, more familiar civilization. The archaeological record tells a quieter, stranger, and in many ways more interesting story. The pre-Hispanic islanders were not Egyptians in disguise. They were not a forgotten outpost of Plato's Atlantis. They were not a static, timeless people frozen in some prehistoric stage until Europeans arrived to wake them up. They were communities with their own histories, rooted in North African ancestry but shaped, generation after generation, by volcanic mountains, trade winds, limited resources, and the particular decisions their ancestors made. They were capable of complex ritual without needing a blueprint from the Nile. They could mummify their dead without having learned it from a papyrus scrolls. They could navigate short sea crossings without being master mariners in constant contact with half the Mediterranean. In other words, they were exactly what the evidence suggests most human groups are when you look closely. Inventive, adaptable, sometimes conservative, sometimes experimental, always more than whatever single label later outsiders pinned on them. Understanding who they were also means being clear about who they were not. They were not a homogeneous Guanche people stretched uniformly across 7 islands. They were not simply noble primitives living in an unchanging past. And they were not passive backdrops to the story that interests us now, the story of their DNA. They were the authors of their own world, and the mummies that lie in the dry caves are traces of how they chose to live and remember, not just raw material for modern curiosity. If you follow one of those steep ravines up from the coast, away from the cultivated terraces and wind-blown settlements, you eventually reach a different kind of landscape. The air feels drier, the rock more brittle under your hands. Up here, caves open in the cliffs like dark punctuation marks. Some of them were once homes, others were granaries, and some, without anyone planning it at first, became archives of the dead. This is where the bodies were prepared. The process, as far as we can piece it together from chroniclers' descriptions, archaeological traces and modern forensic study, was careful and time-consuming. It did not happen to everyone. It did not happen in the same way everywhere. But when a family decided that a person would be preserved rather than simply buried, the work could last weeks. The first step seems to have been drying. On several islands there are references to special houses of mummification, places apart from ordinary dwellings where the body was taken soon after death. There it may have been washed, the hair combed, the limbs gently straightened. Some writers claim that the internal organs were removed, as in Egypt. Others are less clear. The mummies themselves do not always cooperate with tidy categories. Some show evidence of evisceration, others do not. In many cases it looks as though careful external drying alone was the main method. That drying likely relied on the same environmental conditions that make these caves such good time capsules. Low humidity, steady airflow, and a lack of insects do much of the work on their own. Families or specialists probably positioned the body so that air could circulate freely. They may have applied plant-based substances to speed the process, but if they did, most have vanished without leaving obvious chemical fingerprints. What does remain in some cases are hints of fats or resins, smeared along wrappings or pooled in cavities, suggesting that animal fat, plant oils, or tree resins could have been used to protect and seal drying tissue. Once the body was sufficiently desiccated, wrapping began. Here, the islands diverge. On Tenerife and Gran Canaria, many of the best preserved mummies are wrapped in multiple layers of animal skins. Goat and sheep hides, carefully tanned and cut, were placed around the body like nested garments. Sometimes the smooth side of the hide faces inward, against the skin. Sometimes it alternates. Thongs or cords bind the layers, binding arms to sides, legs together. In some high-status individuals, the wrappings are so elaborate that they form a kind of tailored casing, almost like a fitted sleeping bag of leather. On other islands, especially the drier eastern ones, wrapping appears to have been simpler or less frequent. Some skeletons show only traces of textile or hide at certain points, the pelvis, the shoulders, hinting at shrouds that deteriorated more quickly. On La Palma and El Hierro, burial caves sometimes contain loosely arranged bones rather than fully articulated mummies, suggesting that preservation there followed different rules, or that fewer bodies were treated with a full mummification protocol. Even within one island, patterns vary. In some caves, bodies are laid out in rows, heads aligned toward a particular direction, each individual in its own small hollow. In others, the dead are stacked in tiers along ledges, bundled closely together, generations layered like pages of a long book. Some mummies are placed high, hard to reach without climbing. Others lie nearer the entrance. Whether these arrangements reflect status, lineage, time of death, or something more symbolic is still debated. What is clear is that not everyone received this treatment. The majority of indigenous burials across the archipelago are simpler, inhumations without elaborate wrappings, sometimes accompanied by pots, beads, or tools, sometimes not. Mummification seems to have marked out certain people, perhaps individuals of particular status, perhaps members of specific lineages, perhaps those who died well at the end of a long life. The selection criteria are not written down anywhere. We infer them from patterns of age, sex, grave goods, and cave locations, aware that our categories may not match theirs. To their communities, these preserved bodies were not anatomical specimens, they were ancestors. Chroniclers describe relatives visiting the caves, bringing offerings, speaking to the mummified dead as if they were listening. In that sense, mummification was not only about keeping a face recognizably human for longer. It was about stabilizing social memory. A grandfather who had guided the herd routes, a matriarch who knew the water sources, their bodies, intact and located in a particular cave, anchored stories, rights, and obligations. The caves themselves became part of that memory system. Certain ravines on Tenerife, certain high ledges on Gran Canaria are full of burials while nearby caves remain empty. This clustering suggests sacred geographies, places set aside where the boundary between living and dead was thinner. Access may have been controlled. Knowledge of exact locations could have been carried by particular families or ritual specialists. For those people, the island was not just volcanic rock in the ocean. It was a map of remembered bodies, of bones and leather-wrapped forms tucked away in dry stone. Modern forensic study adds another layer, but it does so under very different assumptions and ethics. When radiologists and physical anthropologists examine these mummies, they look for clues etched into bone and tissue. Lines of arrested growth in teeth hint at childhood hunger or illness. Arthritic joints tell of long years walking steep paths, carrying loads, working stone or tending animals. Healed fractures, ribs, forearms, skulls speak of accidents, perhaps falls on rough terrain, perhaps interpersonal violence. A few individuals show sharp force trauma near the time of death, cut marks or depressed fractures that might indicate conflict. Others show signs of chronic disease, spinal changes that could correlate with infection or degenerative conditions. But these readings are always probabilistic. A lesion on a vertebra might suggest tuberculosis, but without soft tissue or genetic traces of the pathogen, certainty is elusive, A broken bone near death could be from a fight, or from a tumble down a ravine. Forensic work sketches possible lives and deaths. It does not settle them. And there is another complication. To obtain some of this information in the past, researchers and collectors sometimes damaged or even dismembered the very bodies they were trying to understand. 19th and early 20th century expeditions pried mummies from their caves, unwrapped them, cut into them, shipped them across oceans, often with little regard for the wishes of any descendants or for the cultural meaning those remains still carried in the islands. Today, standards are different, though not universally agreed upon. Many institutions now favour non-invasive methods: CT scans, surface imaging, minimal sampling for DNA and chemical analysis when justified by clear research questions. There are debates about whether some remains should be reburied, or relocated from display cases to quieter storage, or kept accessible for ongoing study that might illuminate broader histories of health and migration. The ethical question returns us in a way to those dry caves. For the people who placed their dead there, mummification was an act of care and connection, not an invitation to endless scrutiny. As we peer into their bones and genomes, we are also deciding, consciously or not, how much we value their intentions alongside our curiosity. The story written in their tissues is rich, but it was never meant for us alone. Long before archaeologists arrived with notebooks and measuring tapes, people on the islands already knew where many of the caves were. Shepherds moving goats along dry ridges, children daring each other to look over the edge of a ravine, farmers following a stray animal into a side gully and stumbling on a dark opening in the rock. On an island, territory shrinks and deepens at the same time. You learn every fold of the hills that feed you. Stories clung to some of those folds. That cliff is haunted. Don't climb there, it's a place of the old ones. Warnings, half-believed, passed down across centuries. When European chroniclers write that the Guanches themselves guided them to burial caves, they are probably repeating something partly true and partly distorted. Some local people may well have kept track of ancestral sites and, under pressure or curiosity, revealed them. Others likely watched strangers scramble over sacred slopes with a sense of violation they didn't have the power to prevent. Either way, the earliest written discoveries are not really discoveries at all. They are moments when knowledge that was already embedded in the landscape for islanders suddenly became visible to outsiders, who described it in their own language and for their own purposes. Later finds are even more accidental. A storm collapses part of a cliff. A new path is cut between coastal towns. A worker breaks through a thin wall of rock and finds, not empty air, but rows of leather-wrapped forms staring back with hollow eyes. In those moments there is shock, sometimes fear, and very quickly, evaluation. Is there something here that can be sold? By the 18th and 19th centuries, mummies were not just objects of awe, they were commodities. Across Europe, cabinets of curiosity were hungry for the exotic dead. Egyptian mummies were already circulating as collectibles, medical curios, even ingredients in bogus remedies. When news spread that the Canary Islands also hid preserved bodies in cliffside caves, antiquarians took notice. A good mummy could become the centerpiece of a private collection, the talking point in a salon, the subject of an illustrated travelogue. Local entrepreneurs, colonial officials, and foreign visitors all participated in this new economy. Some hired guides to show them promising ravines, others simply followed rumours. A cave that had been visited quietly by relatives in previous centuries might suddenly be stripped in a season. Bodies that had lain in carefully arranged rows were dragged out, inspected, bargained over. The ones that seemed most complete, most visually striking, were prized. Those that were damaged, or too fragile to move easily, might be left behind, jumbled, their original positions forgotten. Each of those removals tore away layers of context that we now struggle to reconstruct. When a mummy arrives at a museum labelled only Guanche Mummy Tenerife, we've lost almost everything the original placement could have told us. Which cave? In which part of the cave? Alone or in a tightly packed group? Near the entrance or deep in a niche? Were there pots beside it? Or tools? Or animal bones? Were there wrappings missing that had been taken earlier as curios or souvenirs? Every detail matters if you're trying to understand patterns of social status, ritual practice, or family grouping. When those details are stripped away, the body becomes a floating specimen, disconnected from the local story it once anchored. Looting and tourism blur into each other here, Some people cut down mummies to sell their hides or bones. Others visited out of morbid curiosity and left with small pieces, strips of leather wrapping, tufts of hair, a finger bone tucked into a pocket as a shocking token. Children from nearby villages sometimes played in half-emptied caves, moving skulls, rearranging bones, not realizing they were erasing a map archaeologists would later wish they had. Each disturbance breaks the original arrangement a little more, like shuffling the pages of a book and throwing some away. This loss isn't just about respectful storytelling. It changes the science. When you're trying to date a body accurately, knowing its exact position in a cave can help you correlate it with other remains, with associated charcoal, with layers of sediment. When you're analysing DNA to see how people on different islands were related, you need to trust that a mummy labelled La Gomera really did come from La Gomera, and not from Tenerife by way of a collector who mixed up his boxes. A single mislabelled specimen can skew a small data set, making it seem as though there was a migration path or a genetic link that never actually existed. Many early collections were catalogued hastily, if at all. A crate marked Mummies, Canaries might hold individuals from 2 or 3 islands, removed on different trips, repacked and shipped together. Family names of donors, shipping dates, the name of the captain who carried the boxes across the sea, these are carefully recorded. The caves they came from are often reduced to vague phrases. A ravine near Santa Cruz, a burial place in the south of Gran Canaria. For modern researchers, that vagueness is like static laid over the signal they are trying to read. Over the last few decades, there has been a quiet shift. Curators, archaeologists, and local communities have started to treat these remains less as trophies and more as displaced ancestors. Detailed inventories are being compiled. Old correspondence is combed for clues about original find spots. CT scans and 3D models allow bodies to be studied without more cutting or unwrapping. Careful sampling protocols mean that when a tiny piece of bone or tooth is removed for DNA analysis or radiocarbon dating, it is documented precisely and justified against a research question, not just taken because it might be interesting. There are also new conversations about where these mummies should ultimately rest. Some argue that they belong in the islands, under the care of institutions and communities directly connected to the places they were taken from. Others suggest that, given their fragile state and the information they still hold, they should remain where the best conservation facilities exist, at least for now. In a few cases, repatriations have occurred, with remains returned from foreign museums to Canarian collections, where they are recontextualized with local input and sometimes quietly moved off display. Improved curation cannot restore what looters and collectors have already erased. A mummy that left its cave without a recorded location will never regain that exact address in the landscape. But the way we handle such bodies now can at least stop the damage from continuing. Better labels, shared databases, collaborative projects that include island-based scholars and descendant communities. All of these help rebuild some of the connections that were severed when the mummies were first cut from their niches and carried down the ravines. In a sense, we are still moving them, but in a different direction, from private cabinets back into shared histories, from anonymous specimens back into lineages that, while partially imagined, are grounded in place. When we speak of their DNA or their radiocarbon ages, we are trying not just to extract data, but to re-anchor them in the islands that shaped their lives in their long sleep. When you stand in front of a Guanche mummy in a dim museum hall, there's often a little plaque with a date on it. Circa 900 CE, between the 11th and 13th centuries. It looks precise, the way a birthday might be. But that year is really the end point of a long chain of inferences, measurements, and quiet arguments. At the core of that chain is radiocarbon dating. It relies on something almost poetic, the fact that every living thing carries a faint trace of cosmic rays. High in the atmosphere, radiation from space strikes nitrogen atoms and turns a tiny fraction of them into radioactive carbon, carbon-14. Plants pull this carbon from the air as they grow. Animals eat the plants. We eat the animals and the plants. As long as you're alive, you're part of that circulating system, taking in fresh carbon-14 that more or less balances what's decaying in your bones and tissues. When you die, the intake stops. The carbon-14 inside you quietly ticks away, decaying at a known rate. Roughly every 5,730 years, half of it disappears. If you take a tiny piece of bone or tooth and measure how much carbon-14 is left compared to stable carbon, You can estimate how long it's been since that body stopped exchanging carbon with the world of the living. For most archaeological sites, this gives a surprisingly reliable clock. But islanders complicate things because islands mean fish, and fish bring the ocean's peculiar sense of time into the body. The sea is full of old carbon. Deep water circulates slowly, carrying dissolved carbon that hasn't been in contact with the atmosphere for hundreds or thousands of years. Marine plants and animals build that old carbon into their tissues, and when humans eat a lot of seafood, their own bones inherit that age. To a radiocarbon lab, someone who lived on salted fish and limpets can look centuries older than they really are. This is the reservoir effect. In the Canaries, this matters. Some mummified individuals show clear signs of mixed diets, terrestrial plants and animals, but also marine resources. If you ignore that and just plug the numbers into a calibration curve, you may push their apparent death dates back unrealistically early, making it seem as though people were mummifying their dead long before they actually were. So archaeologists hedge. A radiocarbon date is rarely taken as a solitary truth. It's one voice in a small committee of evidence. They look at stratigraphy, the way layers of sediment and debris stack over time. In a cave, bodies placed earlier tend to lie beneath those placed later, sometimes separated by thin sheets of dust, fallen stones, or the traces of old floor surfaces. Even in disturbed sites, you can sometimes find pockets where the vertical order is still intact. If a mummy that dates to around 1200 CE is clearly lying above one that dates to about 900 CE, that supports both measurements. They study artifact styles, the shape of a pottery rim, the way a leather sandal is stitched, the form of a belt buckle. These things drift over generations. In the Canaries, certain decorative motifs and manufacturing techniques can be tied to broader pre-Hispanic phases, earlier centuries when communities were largely isolated on their own islands, later periods with more inter-island contact, finally the era when European goods begin to seep into local assemblages. They pay attention to historical horizons. Chroniclers from the 15th century describe still-living practices, including burials, at the time of conquest. If a particular style of wrapping or a specific kind of funerary cave is carefully described by early Spanish writers, then bodies found in those exact conditions probably belong near that horizon or just before it, not 600 years earlier, no matter what an uncorrected radiocarbon date might suggest. Threaded through all this is a broader question. When, exactly, did people arrive on these islands? How many were here at different times? And how did their practices change as populations grew or shrank? The earliest clear archaeological traces of human presence in the Canaries seem to cluster in the first millennium BCE and the early centuries CE, depending on the island. By the time Europeans begin their probing raids in the 14th and 15th centuries, each major island supports a distinct stratified society with its own dialect, customs and burial traditions. Mummification, as far as we can tell, belongs mainly to the later part of that pre-Hispanic story, reaching its most formal expression in the centuries just before conquest, and possibly fading or varying afterward under colonial disruption. But how many people were mummified out of the total population? And what was that total? Here, archaeologists turn to carrying capacity, the ecological ceiling of how many humans an island's land and water can sustain with a given technology. They look at rainfall patterns, soil fertility, the area available for terrace agriculture and pasturage, the productivity of wild resources. They model how many goats a slope can support, how much barley could be grown in a valley, how many people that might feed. The estimates are necessarily rough. Some scholars imagine tens of thousands of people scattered across the archipelago at its peak. Others argue for smaller numbers, perhaps only a few thousand per larger island. Small changes in assumed crop yields, or in how intensively the land was used, swing the totals a lot. And those numbers matter, because they shape how we read the mummies. If total populations were modest, the individuals preserved in caves might represent a relatively high fraction of the dead. If populations were large, then mummification was probably reserved for a narrow slice of society. Elites, ritual specialists, particular lineages. All of this feeds back into how we interpret the DNA results. When researchers say the genetic findings were unexpected, that judgment depends on what timeline and population history you imagine beforehand. If you assume an early colonization, deep isolation, and small stable island populations, you might expect Guanche genomes to look like a tightly clustered, somewhat inbred offshoot of their founding North African ancestors, with very little diversity and clear separation between islands. If you assume instead a later colonization, periodic arrivals, and larger dynamic populations pushed to the edge of carrying capacity, you might predict more variation, genetic signals of multiple migration waves, subtle differences between islands reflecting drift and local bottlenecks, maybe even hints of contact beyond North Africa. If you imagine that mummification flourished only in a late hierarchical phase, you might expect the mummy's DNA to skew toward particular family lines, not representative of everyone living in the huts and rock shelters of the interior. So when the numbers come back from the sequencer, when genomes are reconstructed from teeth that last tasted food 600 or 800 years ago, those sequences are read against these scaffolds of time and demography. The surprise is not just in what the DNA says, but in which of our prior stories about arrival, growth and isolation it quietly agrees with, and which ones it forces us to loosen our grip on. If radiocarbon dating is the quiet clock ticking inside old bone, ancient DNA is the faint whisper of identity still clinging to it. To hear that whisper, you have to damage the very thing you're trying to protect. It starts with a decision that would horrify a casual museum visitor. Which part of the body are we willing to destroy? Not all tissues preserve DNA equally. Soft tissue on a mummy might look miraculous, skin, tendons, even wisps of hair, but most of the genetic material inside it has been shredded by heat, humidity, and time. In the Canary Islands, with their fluctuating temperatures and salty air, that damage is even more severe. So geneticists usually go for the densest, most sheltered structures. The petrous portion of the temporal bone, buried deep in the skull near the inner ear, is a favourite. It's like a vault for DNA, one of the hardest bones in the body, resistant to decay. Teeth are another treasure. The pulp chamber and dentine inside a molar can protect fragments of the genome that have survived for over 1,000 years. In exceptional cases, dried tissue inside the nasal cavity, or within tightly wrapped bundles, may still hold recoverable DNA, but bone and teeth are the workhorses. The process is deliberately brutal, but carefully controlled. A tiny piece of bone is cut or drilled. A tooth is cracked open, its enamel shell sacrificed to reach the softer interior. The powder that results doesn't look like a person, it looks like any other pale dust. But dissolved in chemicals, filtered and coaxed out, are fragments of genetic code only a few dozen letters long, all that remains of sequences that once ran for millions. Those fragments are not taken at face value. Ancient DNA, as a field, was born from embarrassment. Early claims that later turned out to be modern contaminations smuggled in on ungloved hands and stray skin cells. Researchers learned the hard way that the greatest threat to a 900-year-old genome is a living one, so every step is watched for authenticity. Ancient DNA carries characteristic scars. Over time, certain bases, especially cytosine, tend to lose an amino group and masquerade as thymine. This deamination happens most at the ragged ends of very short strands. When scientists line up the sequences they've recovered, they look for that pattern, C's turning into T's, G's turning into A's, clustered near the fragment edges. It's a kind of molecular weathering, the erosion pattern of time. If those scars aren't there, if the reeds look too clean, too long, too perfect, warning bells ring. They measure fragment lengths. Fresh DNA from a cheek swab will happily produce long continuous stretches. Ancient DNA tends to be chopped into little pieces, most only 40 to 80 base pairs long. A histogram of fragment sizes with a steep peak at the very short end is another sign that you're hearing the past, not your laboratory colleague's breath. They estimate contamination. For mitochondrial DNA, which we'll get to in a moment, they can compare the consensus sequence from the archaeological individual to the variation among all the reeds. If many reeds don't match the majority haplotype, that suggests outside DNA has crept in. For males, the X chromosome offers another clue. If an ostensibly male individual shows too many heterozygous sites on the X, it may mean that female DNA has mixed into the sample, and then there's replication. Ideally, the same individual is sampled independently, in different labs, or different extractions are done from separate pieces of bone or tooth. If the same patterns appear across experiments that never shared a tube, confidence grows. The goal is not perfection. It's to reach a point where the remaining uncertainty is smaller than the signal you're trying to interpret. Once you trust that you're actually listening to a Guanche voice, and not a modern echo, you can start asking questions. Different parts of the genome answer different ones. Mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, is the easiest to recover. Each cell has hundreds or thousands of copies, all packed into the mitochondria, those ancient symbiotic powerhouses you learned about in school. It's a tiny genome, only about 16,500 base pairs long, inherited almost entirely from the mother. That means it tracks a single maternal line, a thread that runs back mother to mother to mother. mtDNA can tell you which broad maternal clades a person belongs to, and those clades often have geographic histories. Some are common in North Africa, others in Europe, others in sub-Saharan Africa or the Near East. In the Canaries, mitochondrial haplogroups provide early hints. Are these mummies descended from Amazigh-related women, from later arrivals, from mixed ancestries? But mtDNA is just one sliver of ancestry. It can make an island look homogeneous even when the rest of the genome tells a more complex story. The Y chromosome is the paternal counterpart. Only males have it, passed from father to son. Like mtDNA, it carries lineages that can be grouped into haplogroups with their own geographic and historical distributions. Y chromosome signature can reveal, for example, whether the men in a particular burial cluster share a close male ancestor, suggesting patrilineal kin groups or elite lineages. However, both mtDNA and the Y are narrow views. They follow one maternal line, one paternal line, while ignoring the thousands of other ancestors whose genes mix in every generation. Genome-wide data is the panoramic view. Instead of a single tiny chromosome or circular molecule, researchers sample hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions, of positions scattered across all the chromosomes. From that, they can estimate overall ancestry proportions, measure how closely individuals from different caves or islands are related, detect inbreeding, and even infer past population sizes and bottlenecks. In an island context, these questions become especially sharp. Islands are laboratories of genetic drift. A small founding group arrives, maybe a few boatloads of families, maybe even less. Their genes, by chance, capture only a subset of the diversity from the mainland. Over generations, as children are born and others die, certain variants become common or vanish entirely, not because they're better or worse, but because of pure random sampling. This is the founder effect. In a large continental population, it's diluted by vast numbers and constant mixing. On an island, it can dominate. If a single maternal lineage happens to be represented by many of the founding women, the mtDNA haplogroup might become almost universal. If a few men from a particular Y chromosome line acquire status and have more children, their Y haplogroup can sweep the island. Genetic drift then amplifies these quirks. In small populations, especially if they fluctuate through famines, disease outbreaks, or social turmoil, allele frequencies can swing wildly from one generation to the next. A gene variant that started at 10% purely by chance might end up at 80% or vanish in a few centuries. To a later geneticist, that pattern might look like a signal of strong selection or a separate origin, when it's really just the mathematics of small numbers. For the Guanches, this matters a great deal. If you find, for example, that many mummies share a particular North African mitochondrial haplogroup, is that telling you that only women from one tribe ever reach the islands? Or does it simply reflect a small founding pool, multiplied across time, with other lineages quietly lost? And then, layered on top of all this, comes the storm of conquest. After the 15th century, the genetic landscape of the Canaries changes rapidly. European settlers arrive from Castile, Portugal, Genoa. Enslaved people are brought from sub-Saharan Africa. Surviving islanders are absorbed, displaced, or killed. Over generations, their descendants intermarry. Modern Canary Islanders are a palimpsest of these histories. Indigenous, European, and African ancestries braided together in different proportions from island to island, even from village to village. Ancient DNA must thread a careful path through this mixture. When you sequence a skeleton from a cave, are you really seeing pre-Hispanic island variation? Or are you catching the first ripples of post-conquest admixture, an indigenous woman's child with a European father, a local man whose grandchildren will marry people from far beyond the Atlantic? The key interpretive challenge is separation. Researchers compare genomes from clearly pre-conquest contexts, burials securely dated to before sustained European presence, with those that cluster around the conquest horizon. They model admixture using reference populations from North Africa, Iberia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. They look for segments of DNA that arrive together in large blocks, a hallmark of recent mixing, versus patterns that have been broken up by many generations of recombination. Only by teasing apart these layers can they hope to answer the deeper questions. Which genetic signatures truly belong to the original islanders? Which reflect later arrivals? Which are the exaggerated products of island drift and founder effects, and which hint at distinct migration waves? The mummies, sampled carefully, authenticated patiently, and read with these complexities in mind, become more than individuals. They become time points on a graph, anchors in a shifting sea of genomes. And from that sea, some contours are beginning to emerge. When you zoom out from the noisy details and look at the broad outline, the ancient DNA from the Canaries is remarkably consistent. Whatever the islands later became, whoever arrived in the centuries after conquest, the people whose bodies dried in those caves point stubbornly in the same direction. Again and again, their genomes tug you back toward northwest Africa. On the maternal side, many of the mitochondrial lineages in pre-Hispanic remains fall into haplogroups that are common, or have deep roots, among Amazigh or Berber-related populations of the Maghreb. Some of those lineages are still around today in Morocco, Algeria, and the Atlas regions. Others are rarer now, or appear in forms that look like island-specific offshoots, as if a branch of the tree was pruned from the mainland early and allowed to grow in its own direction out over the Atlantic. Genome-wide analyses tell the same story in a broader accent. When researchers compare the overall genetic profiles of Guanche period individuals to reference populations, the closest matches are not to Iberia, not to the Near East, not to Sub-Saharan Africa, but to ancient and modern Northwest Africans with strong Amazigh components. There are differences, yes, signals of isolation, drift and local history, but the centre of gravity is clear. The founding populations of the Canaries were, in a very general sense, North African islanders, before they were Atlantic ones. The Y chromosome, though, adds an interesting twist. Many male lineages also point to Northwest Africa, carrying haplogroups associated with Amazigh-speaking groups, but in some samples, especially closer to the period of European contact, you begin to see patterns that don't quite mirror the maternal side. In a few contexts, the Y chromosome diversity is narrower than the mitochondrial diversity, as if relatively few male lineages left a disproportionate number of sons. In others, possible hints of incoming male lines appear earlier than equivalent signals on the maternal side. This is where sex-biased migration enters the picture. Human history is full of asymmetries. Trading ventures that moved mostly men, raids that captured women, colonial societies where incoming males took local wives but not the other way around. Over generations, these patterns leave different fingerprints in maternal and paternal DNA. An island's mtDNA might continue to look deeply indigenous, while the Y chromosome shows a stronger contribution from newcomers, or vice versa. In the Canaries, the safest broad reading is this. The deep substrate of both male and female lineages is Northwest African and Amazigh related, but later contacts and social structures may have affected men and women differently. Some islands, some valleys, may have seen more foreign fathers than foreign mothers. Others may have remained comparatively insulated on both lines, and that variation from place to place is another strong signal the DNA keeps insisting on. If you lay out the genetic data island by island, the Canaries stop looking like a single unit and start looking like an archipelago of parallel experiments. Certain islands, particularly those with larger fertile areas or historically denser populations, show more internal diversity in their ancient genomes. Others look narrower, as if founded by smaller groups and left more alone. Mitochondrial lineages that are common on one island might be rare or absent on another. Genome-wide, individuals from neighbouring islands sometimes cluster closely, sometimes drift apart. Archaeology had already hinted at this. Pottery styles, burial customs, and settlement patterns are not perfectly uniform across the archipelago. Linguists working with the few surviving Guanche words and with early colonial transcriptions had proposed regional dialects or even distinct but related languages. The DNA doesn't resolve those debates, but it does nudge them. Where archaeologists saw hints of cultural separation, genetics often sees reduced gene flow. Where linguistic evidence suggested shared origins, genomes tend to cluster. Taken together, a plausible picture emerges. The islands were not colonized once in a single neat wave and then frozen in time. Instead, there were likely multiple settlement events from broadly similar Northwest African sources, perhaps at different times, perhaps targeting different islands. After that, isolation and drift took over, bending each island's gene pool along its own path, with varying degrees of later contact among them and with the outside world. But it's important not to mistake this outline for a finished map. Most of the sequences we have come from a limited number of skeletons, often from particular caves or cemeteries that happen to preserve well and be excavated early. Some islands are represented by only a handful of individuals, others not at all for certain periods. The mummies themselves are biased towards specific social contexts, high-status burials, well-protected locations, while the bones of ordinary people in shallow graves or exposed soils may have vanished completely. Preservation is uneven, sample sizes are small. Choices about which bones to drill, which museums to approach, which caves to prioritize, all create subtle skews. A lineage that looks dominant in the data might simply belong to a family whose burial cave was particularly dry and secluded. An apparent absence of a haplogroup on one island might mean it truly wasn't there, or that the individuals who carried it were buried where damp air erased their DNA centuries ago. So when we say the Guanches were broadly Northwest African and Amazigh related, when we talk about island differences and possible settlement waves, we are speaking in careful generalities, not pronouncing final verdicts. The DNA we have so far supports a coherent, sensible story that fits with archaeology and the faint linguistic record. But it is still just a set of glimpses, scattered points on a graph. The real people behind those points lived lives far richer than their haplogroups. To get closer to that richness, you have to stop thinking about lineages and start looking again at bodies. Some of those bodies told the expected story, others not so much. When researchers first began sequencing ancient DNA from the Canary Islands, many of them had a rough mental template in mind. A founding group or groups from Northwest Africa, isolation, drift, maybe a bit of later contact with Europeans and Africans toward the very end. A tidy narrative of island offshoots. The genomes did not entirely cooperate. On the maternal side, for instance, you do see haplogroups that fit neatly with what you'd predict from Amazigh-related settlers, but you also find certain lineages popping up at frequencies that are odd. Haplogroups that are relatively rare today in mainland North Africa, suddenly very common in particular island cemeteries, or variants that seem to branch off early from known Northwest African types, then go on to develop their own internal diversity almost entirely out over the ocean. To someone used to modern population patterns, this can look mysterious. Why would a lineage that is barely visible today on the continent dominate a valley on Tenerife 1,000 years ago? Why would a mitochondrial branch that seems, on paper, to belong in Morocco be represented mostly by skeletons in a cave on La Palma? That's where the unglamorous forces of drift and bottleneck step into the story. Imagine 30 people stepping onto a new island in small boats, or even 300. Their genes are not a perfect mirror of the larger population they left behind. Just by chance, some lineages will be overrepresented, others left behind completely. Then picture those 30 people having children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, almost entirely among themselves for centuries. In each generation, random events chip away at diversity. A woman with a rare mitochondrial lineage has only sons. A man whose Y chromosome is common on the mainland happens, by luck and social circumstance, to father many children on the island, while another line dies out. An epidemic, a drought, or a volcanic eruption reduces a community to a handful of survivors. Every one of those events is a genetic bottleneck. Each one squeezes the population through a narrow gate and lets chance decide which lineages pass through. Over time, those stochastic moments can make an island population look exotic compared to its source, even if no new people ever arrive. A haplogroup that's a minor background note in North Africa becomes a dominant melody on one island simply because the woman who carried it happened to be among the founders, and her descendants flourished. So when the Canary Island genomes show strange-looking frequencies, or cluster in ways that don't match any modern group exactly, that doesn't automatically mean lost civilizations or dramatic unknown migrations. Often, it means centuries of isolation plus statistical noise. But not every surprise can be smoothed away that easily. When you line up the ancient individuals chronologically, Some patterns suggest that colonization of the archipelago was not a single once-and-done event. Certain haplogroups appear early and are widespread on multiple islands, hinting at an initial spread from a shared northwest African source. Later on, especially in some contexts, you begin to see new lineages that look related but not identical to those first ones, almost as if additional boats had arrived from slightly different Amazigh-related groups at later dates, targeting some islands more than others. Genome-wide, a few individuals stand out as having subtle affinities that lean toward different corners of the North African genetic landscape. They are still fundamentally Amazi-related, but with whispers of other admixture histories, more influence from coastal groups here, perhaps more from inland or Saharan fringe populations there. Coupled with archaeological hints of staggered settlement and cultural change, this has led some researchers to argue for multiple pulses of migration from the continent, separated by centuries. None of this requires invoking people from far-flung regions dropping anchor out of nowhere, but the data also refuses to entirely close the door on wider contacts. A tiny fraction of markers in some pre-conquest individuals look, very tentatively, compatible with low-level gene flow from places outside the immediate Maghreb-Sahara zone. Signals that, in models, could be explained by earlier Mediterranean mixing in North Africa itself, or by thin threads of contact, traders, shipwreck survivors, enslaved captives, moving through the broader Atlantic Mediterranean world long before the Great Age of Sail. It's a delicate interpretive space. A handful of shared variants between a Guanche skeleton and, say, ancient Iberians does not mean regular voyages between Tenerife and Cadiz. Northwest Africa had been a crossroads for millennia. Phoenicians, Romans, Vandals, Byzantines and others had already stirred its genetic pot long before anyone set eyes on the Canary Islands. When Guanche ancestors departed the African coast, they may have been carrying faint echoes of those older mixtures with them. So when a statistical model says that a small percentage of Guanche ancestry can be fit with European-like or Near Eastern-like components, that might simply be picking up the older cosmopolitan history of North Africa, frozen in an island offshoot. Or it might hint at rare direct contacts, passing sailors taken ashore, castaways absorbed into local communities, occasional captured or traded individuals moving in the other direction. The current data can't confidently choose between these possibilities. It can only say something more complex than absolute isolation probably happened. Then there is the late, messy overlay of conquest. One of the biggest headaches in interpreting Canary Island genetics is making sure you're really looking at pre-Hispanic DNA when you think you are. After the 15th century invasions, the archipelago became a mixing ground for Europeans, mostly Iberian but not only, and for enslaved Africans forcibly brought from various regions south of the Sahara. Over generations, their descendants also left bones in the same landscapes, sometimes in the same caves. If a skeleton is not securely dated, or if its archaeological context is blurred by later reuse of burial spaces, a post-conquest individual with mixed ancestry can sneak into an ancient data set. That person's genome might show strong Northwest African components alongside unmistakable European or Sub-Saharan African markers. Without careful screening, it could be misread as evidence for surprising pre-conquest contacts, when it is actually documenting the violence and complexity of the colonial period. Researchers now lean heavily on radiocarbon dating, on stratigraphy, on cross-checking museum labels with original excavation notes to avoid that trap. Even so, a few edge cases remain ambiguous, and those ambiguities are a reminder that the archipelago's genetic story has layers. The Guanche were not the only ones to be buried in those dry caves. What the unexpected results really do is push everyone away from simplistic narratives. No, the Guanche were not isolated refugees from lost continents. They were not mysteriously European, nor purely anything. They were islanders whose roots lay in a complex already mixed Northwest Africa, shaped further by small number effects, by time, by uneven contacts, and later by the great demographic upheavals of conquest and slavery. To see them more clearly, you have to peel back those later layers, and then, within the older strata, stop thinking only in terms of origins and movements. The DNA can tell you where people's distant ancestors came from. Their bodies can tell you something different, how they actually lived. A tooth, under a microscope, looks like a landscape. Ridges and valleys of enamel, tiny pits, fine scratches running in different directions. To a bioarchaeologist, those patterns are as readable as the animal tracks in a hunter's path. Coarse, deep scratches tend to mean a tough, abrasive diet. Lots of gritty particles, maybe from stone-ground flour or dust blown onto fodder. Finer, more polished ware suggests softer foods, more meat or cooked grains, less sand between your teeth. The Guanche mouths we have, when they're well preserved enough to study, are often heavily worn. Even relatively young adults show teeth filed down to flat tables, dentin exposed. That kind of wear doesn't come from years of sipping broth. It points to chewing hard, fibrous plant material, eating food that has picked up volcanic dust, and biting through dried meat and sinew. Dental calculus, mineralized plaque, sometimes traps microscopic plant remains and starch grains. Under a microscope you can see evidence of cereals, pulses, maybe wild plants, confirming what the grinding stones and charred seeds suggest. These were people who lived in a mixed economy of herding, cultivation and foraging. Teeth also record something more intimate: stress. When a child's body is struggling through malnutrition, illness or intense systemic stress, the normal formation of enamel can falter. It pauses, then resumes, leaving a faint line or groove. These are enamel hypoplasias, and in many Canary Island remains they show up as small horizontal scars on the front teeth, like tree rings that never quite formed properly. Count them, and you begin to see patterns. Clusters around the ages when children are weaned or when seasonal hunger would bite hardest. Years when late rains or failed pastures might have meant thin milk for infants and not enough stored grain. On an island, there is no hinterland to fall back on, no distant fields to make up for a local failure. A run of bad weather or animal disease hits everyone, and children's teeth quietly record the shock. Bones keep their own diaries of work. Repeated strain leaves its mark in thickened muscle attachments, in patterns of arthritis, in small stress fractures that have healed. Some Guanche skeletons show robust upper bodies, and joint wear consistent with long distances walked over rough ground, with carrying heavy loads, with twisting motions of grinding and weaving. Others, including some of the most carefully mummified, seem comparatively gracile, their joints less chewed up by daily labour. That contrast has been read, cautiously, as a hint of social differences. The most elaborate mummies, the ones wrapped in multiple layers of tanned goat or sheepskin, interred in prominent caves, often belong to individuals whose skeletons suggest they did not spend a lifetime bent over grinding stones or hauling water. In simpler burials, or in caves where bodies were left more informally, you more often find skeletons with severe spinal wear, arthritic knees, healed rib fractures from falls or accidents. It is not proof of rigid classes in the way medieval Europe had them, but it does suggest that some people's bodies paid a higher daily price than others, and that those same people were less likely to receive the most labour-intensive mummification treatments. At the same time, care is visible. Healed fractures, broken arms, cracked ribs, even serious leg breaks that knitted back together, tell you that injured people were not simply abandoned. A badly fractured tibia that has healed straight enough for walking requires weeks of immobilization and months of reduced mobility. On a small island, that kind of downtime only works if somebody else is bringing you food, helping you move, taking on your share of herding and harvest while you recover. You see arthritic spines that would have made work painful, yet the individuals lived into what for their time counted as old age. Teeth worn so far down that chewing must have been difficult, but with no signs of starvation-induced bone loss. All of this points toward communities that redistributed labour and care, at least within kin groups. Survival on an island seems to have been a collective project, not just an individual contest. The environment threads through all of this. Stable isotope analysis, looking at the ratios of carbon and nitrogen in bone collagen, gives a chemically grounded glimpse into diet over the last decade or so of life. In several studies, Guanche and other island remains show signatures consistent with a primarily terrestrial diet focused on domestic animals and plants. Meat and milk from goats and sheep, cereals, legumes, perhaps native plants. Marine foods seem to play a surprisingly modest role in many individuals, despite the ever-present ocean. That doesn't mean fish and shellfish were absent, but the isotopes suggest they were not the backbone of the diet for everyone all the time. Access might have varied by region, by community, by season. A valley-dwelling pastoral group several kilometres inland may have eaten differently from a coastal village, with easy access to shellfish beds and fishing grounds. Island ecology makes those choices sharper. There is only so much grazable land. Herds can overpressure pastures, especially in drought years, forcing families to move animals farther, to work harder to keep them alive. When rainfall fails, cereal harvests shrink and stored grain becomes precious. In those times, coastal resources, fish, limpets, marine mammals when they could be taken, may have become crucial buffers. Bodies that show signs of repeated childhood stress alongside isotope hints of shifting protein sources could be recording exactly those bad years. Put together, the teeth, the bones, the isotopes sketch a society that was constantly negotiating with its environment and with itself. If some lineages did better over the centuries, if certain maternal or paternal lines swell in the genetic record while others peter out, that may reflect more than blind chance. Families who controlled the best pastures, the most reliable springs, or the safest coastal landing spots would have had an advantage when drought or disease came. Households embedded in strong networks of mutual aid, where care for the injured and elderly was a given, might see more of their children survive to adulthood. Those patterns of survival, repeated over generations, get written into the genome as much as they are written into bone. The unusual frequencies of some haplogroups on particular islands, the success of certain founding lineages, may be echoing not just who stepped off the boats first, but who, through diet, workload, cooperation, and luck, managed to keep their descendants alive on rock and lava in the middle of the Atlantic. For all the detail we can pull from teeth and bones and DNA, there are still big blank spaces in this story. One of the largest is timing. We know, broadly, that people reached the Canary Islands sometime in the first millennium BCE or the first centuries CE, and that they were established there by the time Roman and later medieval writers start dropping vague references to fortunate isles with strange inhabitants. But pinning down exactly when the first small boats made landfall on each island is harder than it sounds. Radiocarbon dates cluster, but they do not line up into a neat single moment of arrival. Some sites suggest occupation earlier than others. Some islands, like Tenerife and Gran Canaria, have richer sequences. Others are quieter in the record. Was there one wave of settlers who slowly fanned out across the archipelago over generations? Or were there multiple voyages from North Africa, centuries apart, bringing new people into already occupied landscapes? Right now, the evidence leans toward more than one migration pulse, but we can't yet say how many or how distinct they were. Mitochondrial lineages that look like they branched off early from North African ancestors sit alongside others that seem to arrive later, perhaps with different pastoral traditions. It might be that certain islands received a refresh of people and ideas centuries after the first landing, while others remained more genetically and culturally isolated. Inter-island movement is another unresolved piece. Boats were clearly part of life here. You cannot reach the islands without them. Yet by the time Europeans arrive, some chroniclers describe Guanche groups as having little or no seafaring, at least in certain islands. Were those observers misunderstanding a more complex reality? Or had skills once present declined in some communities? The DNA gives a mixed answer. Some islands share close genetic ties, hinting at regular marriage and movement across short channels. Others show more divergence, as if their populations were largely reproducing within a closed loop for long stretches of time. Did people move seasonally with herds, crossing narrow straits? Did elites maintain contacts where ordinary herders did not? Or were there long, quiet centuries where each island's story unfolded mostly on its own? Part of why these questions linger has nothing to do with what the past was actually like, and everything to do with what has happened since. Colonial disruption did not just shatter Guanche society in the 15th and 16th centuries. It also tore apart the context that archaeologists rely on. Caves were emptied for curiosities. Mummies were unwrapped in salons and lecture halls from Madrid to London. Skulls were taken as racial specimens and ended up in cardboard boxes and glass cabinets, stripped of names, locations, and sometimes even of island labels. When a body is removed from its burial without careful notes, a whole web of information vanishes. You lose the exact layer of sediment that would have told you whether a nearby charcoal fleck belonged to that burial or to an older fire. You lose the arrangement of objects, the position of the limbs, the orientation of the head. You lose the chance to see whether this carefully wrapped individual lay beside others in more modest conditions or alone in a special alcove. You lose, in other words, the social setting. Excavation history adds another uneven layer. Some islands and some valleys have been studied intensively, others have hardly been touched, or were dug decades ago with methods that would not pass muster today. Radiocarbon samples might come from exposed caves easier for early collectors to access, rather than from low, awkward shelters where more ordinary people may have been buried. The genomes we have so far are drawn from a limited number of sites, often those where mummified remains were most spectacular and therefore most likely to be saved. That sampling bias matters. It can make the wealthy, the well-wrapped, and the geographically convenient stand in for a whole population. It can exaggerate the apparent importance of certain lineages, while others, buried in eroded coastal cemeteries or still hidden in unexcavated rock shelters, remain silent. The future of this story depends on filling those gaps slowly and carefully. More genomes, spread across all the islands, across different time periods and burial types, will help us see whether the patterns visible now hold up or dissolve. Are those unusual haplogroup frequencies really a signature of founder events and isolation, or just an artifact of who happens to have been sampled? Better dating will tighten the timeline. High-precision radiocarbon on short-lived materials directly associated with specific individuals, combined with Bayesian modelling, can sharpen our sense of when population shifts occurred and how rapidly. Proteomic analysis, studying ancient proteins preserved in dental calculus or bone, may clarify diet and disease in ways isotopes alone cannot. Refined isotope work, using multiple elements and local baselines carefully built from modern plants and animals, can distinguish between a person who grew up on one island and moved to another, and someone who lived and died in the same valley. But there is another kind of work that is just as important as new technology, the work of deciding how and whether to study these remains at all. These are not simply data sets. They are the dead of communities whose descendants still live on the islands, even if under new names and blended ancestries. Ethical collaboration means that research questions, sampling strategies, and the ultimate fate of the mummies and bones are not dictated solely by outside experts, but negotiated with local authorities, indigenous organizations, and broader island societies. It means asking whether drilling another tooth for isotopes, or powdering another petrous bone for DNA is justified, what will be learned, and how that knowledge will be shared. It means considering reburial, or new forms of care, for remains that have spent centuries in drawers. It means acknowledging, openly, that earlier generations of collectors and scientists treated these bodies in ways that would be unacceptable today, and trying imperfectly to do better. Under all of this lies a simple tension. The Canary Islands are unusually good at keeping certain things. Dry caves hold hair and skin and woven mats long after they would have vanished elsewhere. Cool, stable microclimates preserve collagen and DNA that, on a humid mainland, would be nothing but dust. In that sense, the islands are like vaults, storing answers far beyond the usual archaeological horizon. Yet they also preserve mysteries. An eroded coastline that once held a landing beach tells us nothing now about the first canoe that scraped onto its sand. A broken chain of oral tradition, severed by conquest, does not regrow. A body lifted from its resting place a century ago and mislabeled in a museum carries information that our best instruments can read, but some questions: who loved this person? What name did they answer to? What stories did they tell their children about where they came from? Remain out of reach. We can close in on the timing of the first voyages, model the number of migration pulses, trace faint chemical hints of journeys between islands. We can reconstruct diets, workloads, even sometimes particular episodes of childhood stress. The picture will get sharper, but some parts of the Guanche past will stay just beyond the edge of focus, folded into rock and ocean and forgotten speech. The islands have saved more than we had any right to expect. They have also kept secrets. If we step back from the details, the outline that emerges is surprisingly gentle. The people whose bodies dried in those caves were, in genetic terms, very much of North Africa. Their closest deep connections lie with Amazigh-speaking groups on the mainland, with threads that reach farther into the broader tapestry of the Mediterranean and the Atlantic coast. But once they landed on these islands, time and geography began to bend that inheritance. Each island took that shared North African base and reshaped it. Founder events left some lineages common on one island and rare on another. Isolation amplified certain haplogroups until they looked almost unique. Small boats crossing short channels blurred some boundaries, while stretches of quiet kept others distinct. The genomes do not show a single simple origin story. They show a family of related histories, each one slightly different, each one written by the peculiarities of wind, current, rock, and human choice. This is why the DNA felt unexpected when it was first announced. Not because it overturned everything historians and archaeologists had pieced together, but because it refused to sit neatly inside any one story. It did not confirm a pure, untouched island people, nor did it reveal some dramatic hidden migration from far away. Instead, it complicated the picture we thought we had, and asked us to hold several truths at once: continuity and change, rootedness and movement, isolation and connection. That is how science often moves forward. A new method arrives, or a new sample is tested, and what we thought was a clear line turns out to be a braided river. The past does not become less real, it becomes more textured, and if we are patient and a little humble, that complexity can be strangely calming. There is no final word tonight, only a better question to fall asleep turning over in your mind. If you'd like more stories like this, it genuinely helps if you tap like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from, and which part of this Long Island story stayed with you as the lights go out.